I'm Jim Steyer, and thank you very much for coming to our session on how teens really feel about social media. As a teenager, I really feel strongly. No, I wish I was a teenager. I'm actually just the moderator of the panel. I am the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, which hopefully some of you guys use. It's the leading kids media and child advocacy group in the United States. That's my background. I'm a Stanford professor, and I am the father of 4 young people who spend on and off time on social media. So let me introduce the panelists. On my right, on your far left, is Sage Hirschfeld, who is from here in Austin, Texas, is a sophomore at Duke, and is a teen activist on issues related to social media and other stuff. So we're really glad to have you here today, Sage.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Next to Sage is Dawn Bounds, Dr. Dawn Bounds. She's a professor at UC Irvine. She's one of the leading scholars in the field of the impact of, well, media technology on young people. But to me, what's most interesting, other than that she's a mom of a youngster who goes to school at San Francisco State, is that she is a clinician. And so she spent many years as a nurse practitioner and nurse overseeing clinical effects of some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. And so it's great to have Dr. Bounds here today.
Thank you.
On my right, your left, is my good friend Frances Haugen. Frances is from Iowa. Mm-hmm. Always start with that. Both of her parents are profs.
Yeah.
And
I'm an academia brat.
She's exactly. And as you may know, a few years ago, Frances became a national figure, and in my opinion, a national hero, by exposing a lot of the stuff that Facebook and Instagram were doing, not just in the context of their impact on young people, but also on misinformation, disinformation, and quite frankly, in many ways, I think, as someone who's worked in this field for quite a few years, really exposed broadly to the public and opinion leaders the lack of responsibility and the lack of accountability that companies like Facebook and Instagram have. And Frances has worked across a number of companies in Silicon Valley, many of whose funders were just bailed out this morning by the Federal Reserve. So it's pretty impressive lineup we've got. So Frances, Dawn, but we'll start with you, Sage. So Sage, one of the things that we've seen in our research at Common Sense Media, so we do about 3 or 4 studies a year on media and tech and its impact on young people. And right now we're focusing mostly on the impact of social media, technology, and media more broadly on the mental health of young people in this country. So, and by the way, I'll just one other thing before I ask the question, Sage. We are in a mental health, one of the assumptions I go into this discussion with is that we have a youth mental health crisis in the United States right now. So 40%, if you read the stats, 40% of teenagers in the last year when they were surveyed said they'd experienced some form of depression. All of this being exacerbated by the pandemic, but still a very big issue for any of us who are parents or teenagers or citizens of this country.
And it's been steadily rising even before COVID. So
yeah.
You can't blame this on COVID. It's been hockey sticking for at least 7 years.
And we were about to begin a huge campaign at Common Sense, a national campaign on youth mental health, when COVID happened. And we postponed it, and now we're going to go launch it, and we'll talk about it in the context of this. And this is something that we'll talk about too. You know, 1/3, Frances really exposed this, 1/3 of girls on Instagram said that their experiences on that platform alone made their body image worse. So this is the context we want to have this discussion in. And Sage, it's the way that I sort of want to ask the question to you. So one of the things we understand, though, from spending millions of dollars a year on research at Common Sense, is that it's actually more nuanced than just blaming everything on internet companies or on social media platforms. It has there are opportunities, and there are a lot of challenges. And we kind of think of it, I would say, as sort of a double-edged sword. So, Sage, as an activist, a queer trans youth, and now as a student at Duke, tell us a little about your experience and how you see this more broadly, and then we're going to have a discussion among all you guys quickly.
Yeah. Okay, for sure. Easy one first. It's definitely hard. I feel like my relationship with social media definitely feels like a battle, kind of a tug of war of how can I like be on it and be connected to my peers, because like in this world, it's kind of essential. It feels essential socially to be plugged into platforms so that I can connect with people, especially also like growing up in Texas, queer and trans, sometimes I needed to expand where I could find community because it wasn't exactly right around me. So social media was hugely beneficial to be able to feel that, but at the same time, it's hard to go into a little bit without accidentally losing yourself, losing your time, losing your attention. And losing some of your own like emotional regulation. I'm really not surprised by those statistics. I've noticed in myself and my own peers, like even though we like social media, it makes us more anxious. It makes it harder to pay attention. It's like not a part of my day that I look back on and think like, wow, I loved those hours I spent scrolling today.
Does the 40% number for teens, that's teens who admit that they've experienced depression. So the number is going to be higher. Remember, when you do a survey like that, not everyone's going to admit that. Did those numbers surprise you at all?
No,
Not
not
at all.
necessarily.
And Dawn, you as a leading researcher in this field, you've talked a lot about both the upsides and the downsides of social media, and you probably see it in your own kid, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you've seen it as a practitioner. How do you look at this more broadly? And then we're going to get into this, but we're going to talk a lot about how do we do our best to protect young people online and avoid some of the toxic elements of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's that upside and downside, right? And so how do we increase the upside, the sense of connection that Sage just talked about, the feelings of belongingness, and then mitigate some of the downside. Losing time, feeling addicted, being unproductive. We have a responsibility to our young people to put up some guardrails, to manage the time they're spending. We know that they're there. So how do we leverage that social media space for good so that we can use it to our advantage to address the mental health crisis?
And let me ask you a follow-up question on that. So when you still are a practitioner, right, in addition to being an academic?
Yes.
What do you see as the biggest impact of the pandemic in terms of both youth mental health crisis, but also the social media aspects of the youth mental health crisis that we're facing?
Well, I think that the pandemic, what I saw in my office was lots of anxiety just going through the roof in terms of young people, their parents as well, but I see the young people, and so I think the pandemic created a sense of isolation, and young people went to social media to fill that void, and that's what's happening. And with filling that void, it was a Band-Aid. It never really got to the core of why they were feeling the way they were feeling in the first place.
So Francis, picking up on what Sage and Don said, what made you, I actually think this is interesting for you to tell the story because probably most of you have not seen Francis speak live before. What made you, having been an experienced product design person at Google, Pinterest, and then Facebook, what made you go public and become a world-known whistleblower? Was it the stuff around misinformation and disinformation that you knew? Or was it what you saw in terms of the impact of what those platforms were doing to young people, or both?
So I think it's important that there's two different decisions there. So one is, why did I blow the whistle?
Yep.
And then why did I come out publicly? The reason I blew the whistle was, so I've worked on algorithms at Google, search quality. I worked on algorithms at Pinterest. So I was the lead product manager for the team that picked out which pins and in which order you saw them on Pinterest. And I co-founded the computer vision team at Yelp. And so I come to Facebook to work on civic misinformation. And in the winter of 2020, so like December 2020, it's less than 30 days after the election, Facebook dissolves the team inside of Facebook that was responsible for making sure that they were a positive impact on society. So after 2016, they came in and said like, oh wow, we missed the Macedonian misinformation farms, we missed XYZ things, like we were asleep at the wheel. We're not gonna do that again. They did a really quite good job at the 2020 elections. And right after that, they dissolved that whole team. And that was the moment when I realized there was no way that Facebook could save itself. That all the literature on change management says, if you want to change an organization, it's so hard for an individual to change. It's even harder for a group of people to change. You have to pick a vanguard and say, they're marching in the right direction, we're going to support them. Either you're with them or against them. And Facebook did that for 4 years until right after the election when they let it go. And so that's why I blew the whistle. I came out publicly because my lawyers told me I was deluding myself that I could stay anonymous and that security by obscurity is not real. You're basically just a ticking time bomb because like Facebook could have outed me at any point because they knew from what documents there was reporting on. And so I basically had to make a choice of whether or not I wanted Facebook to tell my story or if I wanted to tell my story myself.
And how about a little about that, because I know that some of what you put out there was information about how both Facebook, but particularly Instagram, affected young people's body image, and that they knew this. By the way, you know, I wrote a book in 2012 called Talking Back to Facebook. It really pissed off Mark and Cheryl, who I know very well, and they were very angry. They actually wrote me, they tried to block the publication of a book, which is a First Amendment law professor at Stanford, as a joke. But they were so upset, and one of the chapters was about body image, because I had a young colleague at Common Sense Media who had done her senior honors thesis in college about how all of her friends, she had interviewed like 100 young women, and how all of them essentially photoshopped their body image constantly in those days, young people used to be on Facebook, right? Instagram hadn't started yet. So they were on notice when I wrote a best-selling book about this in 2012. They denied that. How much of that was a factor for you when you put that stuff out there?
So a big part of why I came forward was as an algorithmic specialist, I felt that the public did not understand that there's a thing called engagement-based ranking. So this is, does it get the clicks? Does it get likes? Does it get comments? Does it get dwells? And I'll give you a concrete example of the consequences of that way of directing our attention. So a journalist had a new baby. He was asking me about this. He's like, can you explain this to me? He said, I had a new baby, cute, happy, healthy baby boy. They made an Instagram account for the baby. The baby had 5 friends. All of them are happy, healthy babies. And yet, so the only thing any of these adults are posting are happy, healthy, cute babies, yet 10% of his feed was mangled children. Like children from accidents, children die of cancer, kids with tubes coming out of them, kids with horrible deformities, suffering children. He's like, how did we get from cute, happy babies to suffering babies? And it's because the algorithm was like, ooh, you like babies. I have content that people who like babies dwell on, they click on it. And it's because the algorithm is blind, and it pushes us towards more and more extreme content, because that's what gets the engagement.
So Sage, when you were talking right before this, you mentioned that you sort of go back and forth between deleting some of your social media accounts. Talk to us about that, because I think it's really important for the audience to understand what young people like you go through. Talk about your sort of experience over the last few years, how you, with your own social media account, specifically like which platforms, et cetera, and why.
Yeah, for sure. A few years ago, I feel like what started my more awareness around mental health was I took a couple months where I was backpacking, so I was totally removed, completely off the grid. And when I came back, I was like, wow, this makes me so much less happy. So I immediately deleted Instagram the first day I was back. And then because
you had no social media when you were on backpacking, nothing.
Yeah, totally nothing away from my phone for 2 months. And before that also, actually I had TikTok, so I deleted TikTok and Instagram. But then I still found myself pulling up the Instagram web browser and going on Instagram Reels. And then I would be lost for hours. And so I was like, okay, this is so bad. I'm gonna delete this or stop going on this. And then I moved to YouTube Shorts, right? Which are even not as good as Instagram Reels. So the quality was getting worse, which interestingly enough, I noticed the algorithms on different platforms. So the platforms with the best algorithms I would avoid the most because I knew that they could really lock me in. Whereas YouTube's not as good, honestly. But still, even now, for years I've been working, I put in social media time limits, so it stops me after 15 minutes. I have been working on different habits to break out of a cycle of scrolling. But yeah, still sometimes I find myself on Instagram or Snapchat Reels, yeah.
And because we're going to talk, I want to talk about design in a second, because Francis is an expert in design. We just passed a bill in California last year called the Age Appropriate Design Code over the opposition of much of the tech industry. But one more question on that, Sage. Now what are you on? And now you're 21. So at what age? So what age did you start like really heavily using those platforms?
Really heavily using. I have been on Instagram since middle school, actually,
Middle school.
which was pretty early. I would say the heaviest use was probably in high school. And then definitely the pandemic also. Like, it's hard when you just have time. And honestly, I feel like my generation is really bad at being bored. Like, we just immediately go to social media and there's like nothing that stops us. So yeah, definitely the pandemic. And I'm like fighting and kicking to try to get out of it now, but it's really hard.
But so 10, 11, you started?
Yeah,
And
probably
most of your
11,
friends-
12.
Most of your friends still here in Austin?
Oh, for sure, yeah.
For sure. Okay. So does that surprise you, Don, on the research you've done? Because remember, you're supposed to be 13 and over to be on all these platforms.
Right, it doesn't surprise me. Another piece of what Sage just said is that their generation is bad at being bored, right? And so being on social media is also changing brains in terms of that stimulation. And so the stimulation that you receive off of social media, if you're not receiving it elsewhere, guess where you end back up at? Back to the place that stimulates your brain.
Yeah.
And so I can relate to this piece of bad at being bored because you need that stimulation. Your brain is changing as you feed it with all of the stimulation.
Well, that's a really, I would love to hear both of you talk more about that, because I have been accused for many years of being ADHD, which is in fact true. But I do not use social media, even though the organization I found is the biggest critic of the platforms and has been for well over a decade. But I really do not use the platforms myself, partly because I'm aware that I think I would go down the same rabbit hole that you've gone down, or that all young people, including my own 4 kids, go down when they get on those platforms. But it's also when I wrote Talking Back to Facebook, again, not as an expert, it's not my field of academics at all. I wrote a lot about attention and distraction, just the constant change of attention and distraction. Is that something both Sage and Don that you all are aware of and worry about? Because I see it in my students at Stanford. They don't have the ability to focus as long. They write differently. I've been a professor for 30 years, so I've watched their writing change. They write shorter, you can just see their brains are more distracted. Do you feel that, Sage, that's true about you and your peers? And then, Don, I wonder what you think the clinical evidence is. And then, Francis, you can describe how it's designed that way. But Sage, you see that?
Oh, 100%. I actually just like last week, I was sitting in class and then like something happened and I didn't fully understand. And my first instinct for some reason was to reach for my phone. I was like, what is that? When I feel confused, I want to start scrolling when like, that wouldn't help me. Like, that's the opposite. But I think what it is because it's a place that's familiar but also new.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what's going on in my physics class maybe, but I know what it's like on TikTok right now. And like, it's easy to just retreat back to that.
See, I will say something. I almost did this at the beginning, but you're not my students, and you probably paid to come to South by Southwest. But at Stanford, I banned laptops and phones. So I would not let you guys have your laptops open in my class. I would not let you have your phone over there because I know that the kids won't pay attention. And it's not because I don't think it isn't an interesting class. I just think they can't help themselves. And they say, well, we have to take notes. And I say, I know you learned how to write at some point in grade school. And you go to Stanford, so I assume you know how to write, even cursive. But it's because about 10 years ago, I basically banned it. And I always threaten that I'm going to come around class. I never do. But I threatened the first class that I'm going to take away there. If I see you with your laptop open or your phone open, I'm going to come out, embarrass you in front of the whole class, and take your phone away. I've actually never done it. But it's because and by the way, I know that as someone who sits in an audience sometimes and starts looking at my phone because I think, oh God, I sent that email or that text or whatever. So do you see that? Tell us about that clinically, Don, because as both a practitioner and a scholar, what's going on in terms of everybody's brains, but particularly young people's brains?
Yeah, so as we move away from diagnoses in the field of mental health to more so core symptoms.
Yep.
One piece of a core symptom with ADHD and depression and anxiety is really about arousal, right? And so, you have hyperarousal, which is probably your anxious person, right? They are overly aroused and stimulated, and so they might scroll to numb and to come down, right? So there's a regulation that is attempting to occur.
Scrolling is to come down.
Scrolling is to come down.
relax.
They're self-soothing.
They're self-soothing, right? And then the other piece of it, so my son also has ADHD, and believe it or not, his attention, the way he's able to filter things is very different from the way I'm able to filter things, right? So if I get lost on my phone, I'm missing whatever is being said around me. Blank space, haven't heard it. Whereas I remember him as a little kid, he'd get in trouble for talking to the kiddo next to him, and the teacher would be like, "What did I just say?" He'd repeat back verbatim what the teacher would say, and somehow he was able to filter this attention in a way that it felt like a gift to me that I would never be able to do. So I think we have different ranges of arousal. Some of us are gifted, and again, you have to also keep in mind there is a visual input, there's auditory input, there's kinesthetic input. How do we receive our information? That is also different for various people.
Go ahead, Fran.
I think I would chime in there also is that humans have coping strategies. So like when we spent more time around each other, so this is like people used to go to church, people used to be part of bowling leagues, else clubs, clubs in general. We get soothed by being in community. And once you start not having that route, people are putting a surrogate in, which is they have their virtual community and they self-soothe and dissociate that way to avoid those feelings,
Yeah.
to avoid feeling uncomfortable.
Yes.
And Sage, let me ask, do you think you use social media, or you and your, I know it's unfair to say speak for your peers, speak for all teenagers, but do you use social media as sort of a soothing mechanism, do you think?
Oh, 100%.
Explain that.
I think it is. It's any state that's like uncomfortable. It's really easy to just pick up your phone, whether you're feeling, confused, anxious, bored. Like people talk about, I just had such a hard time on that test. I just need to sit in my bed and scroll on TikTok, or to relax also, which is interesting because it only makes things worse. It's an empty coping mechanism, really. And I feel like we know it, but also it really it does feel like an addiction. Because I don't want to be on my phone, really, at all.
It feels like an addiction because it is an addiction.
One of the long-term things that I'm really concerned about is when you talk to people who have substance abuse issues,
Yep.
it is commonly accepted that people stop emotionally maturing from the point at which they start using. So if you start becoming an addict at 17, at 16, at 18, it's remarkable. You can talk to 30-year-olds and you're like, wow, you are remarkably immature. And it's because instead of working through their problems or figuring out coping strategies or growing, making different choices, they numb themselves.
It's a Band-Aid.
It's a Band-Aid. And so we should be thinking about what's the consequence of having a whole generation who, when the physics test is confusing, they're like, ooh, I'm going to go into the soothing.
But I think adults do it too, by the way.
Oh, they totally do.
And I think we all do it too.
Yes.
I actually think it's now, and I want to talk about the design stuff in a second, but I want to pick up on one thing that you said, Don. So some colleagues of mine at Stanford about a decade ago did a big research study that basically said that multitasking is a myth, right? Is a myth. And I believe that, by the way, right? I do not believe that right now, if you're sitting on your phone checking out what happened to the Warriors or whoever's where and whatever, the bracketology of the women's and men's NCAA tournaments that came out, if you're looking at that, there's no way you can remember what Dawn is about to say. Or even if you hear, but you're just trying to figure out where the Texas basketball team is going to play in the NCAA. But do you disagree with that? Because I thought that was definitive research, and for me, it's totally true. There's no way you can actually, your brain can do two things effectively at once. Do you think that is multitasking? That's because you sort of implied your kid can multitask effectively. What do you think clinically?
Effectively is the key word there. I don't know how effectively, even for him, again, diagnosis of ADHD, there were challenges there, right? The filtering of information was challenging for him. Yeah, he can talk to his kiddo and still hear the teacher, but what is he retaining? And what can he then apply later on is the question. I used to think as a mom, I was like expert multitasker. I feel like the older I get, and perhaps the longer I've been on social media, that seems less likely. I'm noticing now that there is blank space and just missing information, to whereas before I used to think I can pull it in. So I think you're onto something with multitasking being a myth.
That's an incredibly important thing for people to think about from a productivity standpoint, to me. I mean, if you write, like Frances is in the middle of writing her memoirs, right?
I just finished.
You just finished, right? And then we will hold a book party for her here in Austin, and all of you will be invited. So, when you write, I've written 3 books. How do you do it? You do not sit there and like look at your phone all the time, or do you?
No,
Or
like
do you?
I'm one of these odd people who can have like 4 cups of chamomile tea and then stay up working until 2 a.m.
Yeah.
And so I'm self-soothing through, chemicals there. But it's
Better, chamomile is better than others.
And I don't like, I like late night. Like I have a little ADHD too. And if I work later in the evening, I have like a little less energy. And so it's actually a lot easier for me to focus. And so my poor husband who's sitting over there, I'll just be like, yep, sorry, honey, not coming to bed. And just stay up writing.
But do you shut everything else out?
Yeah, because it's dark. I sit under a warm blanket. Like it really is like I just isolate.
Because that's how I write.
Yeah.
So I do it in the morning. I'm the complete opposite. I get up and I write from like 5:30 to 8.
Yeah.
It's like writing a term paper in college. No way. I write long. By the way, I write longhand.
Ooh.
I write long. By the way, so do a lot of people who are the age of 50, because A, we learn to write that way, and B, that's how I think.
Yeah.
So I never write anything on I write emails and stuff on a phone, but I write everything longhand because I just get it down, and I don't want to go back and constantly edit while I'm writing. I just want to get the idea down. Remember, you got plenty of time to go back and edit it and rewrite. But I use everything as the people at Common Sense Media. I need paper.
I think part of why I write at night is no one contacts me. Like everyone else is asleep, and so it's like there's less distractions.
Same thing from 5:30 to 8:30 in the morning. Nobody up, my kids aren't up, my wife's not up. You can just go there, but no distraction. So Sage, here you are. You're like a sophomore at Duke. Yeah. And even though you're taking boring engineering classes, but I'm sure you're taking you have to write in some of those classes. How do you write? Do you use it? Do you get distracted when you write, or can you really get in a zone?
It really is hard to get in the zone also. But I can, but I do have to I have to hide my phone, actually.
You literally hide your phone.
I literally hide it. I will put it somewhere around my room and then forget, or I'll put it deep in my backpack. I can't have it in my pocket when I write. I can't see it. And I have to just put on music and just really focus in. Also now, because you can get text on your computer, if you have an Apple computer, I have to silence that. Otherwise, it can be really hard.
So I want to talk about design for a second. And maybe, Frances, I want to talk about how it actually works. Maybe you can explain to the audience, since you are literally help design some of the most important products and platforms, how does that work, and how was this intentionally done? And then, Dawn, I want to ask you about how the design factors really impact people's behavior.
So I would say when the words I always pause on words like intentionally done, because the things that are intentional are that these systems are managed by metrics. It's very hard to say is this version of Facebook better than that version of Facebook, because you and I see different versions. We don't see the same things because it's different content, we have different interests. And so they have these clouds of metrics. And the problem is that any system you reduce down to a handful of metrics is going to have blind spots. So algorithms are blind little hill climbers. They're just optimization engines. And I'll give you an example from my work at Pinterest. So we found that our algorithms were getting good enough that people were getting bored, right? So if you pinned a picture of a daisy, like a daisy pillow, the thing you were most likely to repin next was another daisy pillow. But how many daisy pillows do you really need to look at, right? Your feed would get homogeneous. And so we had to intentionally add into the system diversity, variety. And we got a bump in 6% consumption. So I am part of the problem too. But all of these systems, unless they explicitly have guardrail metrics, the externalities that those corners, those shortcuts the algorithms take to move their metrics up are invisible. And that's where the problems come from.
So explain that, and then explain why we wrote the legislation that we wrote in California this past year. It's now, we're doing it in Europe
Yeah.
right now. Talk about that from a legislative standpoint, and then I want you all to do that.
Sure.
By the way, we're gonna go to audience questions relatively soon, because we want you to ask whatever you wanna ask, and there's at least one mic. Let's talk a little about legislation, because I wanna talk about solutions too, and get that in, before you all start asking questions.
So when we talk about age-appropriate design, it's things like, should kids get algorithm that's picked for them by should kids get content that was picked for them by an algorithm, or should they get content only delivered if they ask for it? Because that is wildly divergent differences. All those suffering baby pictures would not show up in your feed if that dad had only been getting content he asked for. It's also things like, how exposed should you be? Like, younger children don't necessarily understand what is appropriate to share or not share. Having accounts that are by default more private so other people can't find you unless you intentionally connect with them. That protects kids from things like predation. But all of those things are against the business interests of these platforms. Like, when you make it harder to find someone, people have fewer connections. When you don't have the ability to independently put content in their feed, like you have to wait for them to go find it, people consume less content. It's like you said before, you can tell that YouTube has less sticky algorithms, and you use it yet less, right? And so all these things, we have to have outside constraints, otherwise the business interests are just pushing you towards more compulsive consumption.
So we wrote a piece of legislation last year in California. We wrote two big pieces of legislation last year in California. One was called the Age Appropriate Design Code. We passed it in London. The UK is no longer part of Europe. So we had to pass an Age Appropriate Design Code in the UK. And now there's one sitting in Brussels, which is very, very similar. But we wrote one in California that basically holds the platforms liable for the design of their platforms and says that they can be sued for that. We also wrote a piece of legislation which is about social media platform liability, which holds them legally liable for issues. So for mental health issues like mental health and really severe mental health disorders, we didn't do this last year, I'll explain the story in a second, but all the downside impacts that are provable and harms and hold them legally liable. So that passed the California Assembly. Remember, for you all who want to understand politics in the United States legislatively, the federal government, the Congress, has not passed a privacy law since Mark Zuckerberg was in grade school. That is completely true. Because of the dysfunctionality of Washington politics, deeply divided partisanship, and quite frankly, the incredible power of the tech lobby, they have not passed a federal privacy law. They have not passed any of this. So about 10 years ago at Common Sense, because we're based in San Francisco, we have a dozen offices, but we're based in San Francisco, we just started writing laws in California because we realized all the companies are here, and California, whether you like it or not, is a functioning democracy. You may not agree with it, but it's a functioning democracy where they actually pass legislation. That's why the law of the land in terms of privacy in the United States, the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, is the law of the land, because once you pass it in California, all the companies have to comply with it there. So even if you live in Texas or if you live in the state of Washington or wherever, you still have to comply with it, right? So the bill that got held up at the last second, it passed unanimously through the Assembly and then mysteriously got buried in the Senate by one senator, I wonder why, would hold them legally liable for the harms done on their platforms. That's a very, very significant thing because it allows lawsuits and it also provides for $250,000 fines per incident where it happens. So it got held up. It's been reintroduced with a stronger bill author, which matters politically. And I think it's going to pass this year unless Gavin Newsom, our governor, who I like overall, vetoes it, but I don't think he will. But it also involves, so I'm sure many of you have dealt in some ways or another in your communities with the crisis of opioid abuse. Particularly, we have a huge fentanyl problem in California. So now we also added to the bill, partly for political reasons, fentanyl, the fact that if the platforms, which they do, they are your gateway to fentanyl and opioid purchases, but also to ghost guns. So now that's part of the legislation too, because we consider them to be harmed. So it's been reintroduced with one of the two most powerful senators in California, and I think it will pass. So the reason I say that is there are legislative solutions. Francis, when you have become a really great partner to Common Sense Media on this, you've started your own organization to focus on these issues. Talk about what you would like to see happen legislatively. And then Sage and Don, I'd love to hear what you think about this, about what Francis is proposing, because she's our partner on a bunch of this. And then shortly, we're going to let you guys get up and ask whatever questions you want.
So in the United States, the federal government doesn't tell you what to eat at your meals. It's not like, oh, you must eat broccoli today, you must have kale today. They do, though, have nutritional labels on all the food packages. And they have laws that say if a company says, I have these ingredients in my food, what's on the label needs to be in the can. And that hasn't always been true. That's a privilege we've only had for a quite limited amount of time. When it comes to social media platforms, right now, American citizens don't have the right to ask how these systems behave, like the choices that are being made, what the risks are. And I'm a big proponent of laws like what Europe passed. So they passed a law that wasn't about banning certain kinds of content. It was a systems-based law. It said, hey, the public has a right to know what harms the platform knows about. You can't hide your research. You can't lie about your research. Like a few weeks before I came out in 2021, Facebook literally wrote a letter to the Senate saying, so the Senate asked, tell us about any harms you know about to children's mental health. And Facebook wrote them back a letter that totally sidestepped the question. They just ignored answering the question, right? Because they can. And in places like Europe, they now have, the public has a right to ask questions and get answers. And once we have things like that, we can do things like boycotts, like advertiser or usage. We can do divestment. We can push for laws. We can do protests. But right now, we can't do any of those things because when we come to the platforms and we say, we need you to change this, they're like, oh, we fixed it. And we have no way of actually knowing what progress is made. And so that's where I really stand in terms of supporting laws.
And now you're pushing, because we're going to push it in Canada.
Yeah.
Basically, our strategy is to shame Washington into doing something.
So Canada is going to be proposing a law very similar to the Digital Services Act, that's a European law, with a duty of care obligation. So for example, if any of you got hurt in this room, like maybe you tripped on a wire as you came out and got hurt, you have, the conference has an obligation to keep you safe within reasonable bounds. And right now, we don't have any similar duty of care obligations for things like this. So I'm hoping we can get that law passed in Canada this year. I have a book coming out in June, and I'm hoping that can help support that whole process. And I think I'm very optimistic about the future.
So Dawn and Sage, if you had a magic wand and you could just decide what the legislation done here in Texas or in North Carolina where you're going to school, Sage, where you're going to school, but Dawn, you're teaching in California. What would you like to see done? At the legislative level, and then I want to ask you a practical question and then start asking questions from the audience. What would you like to see done?
So I really like the idea of transparency. As a researcher, I don't like the idea of research being hidden. I want that information available to me and available to the public, number one. But that is only a small percentage of us, right, that are going to look at the research. And so I think that it's also really important that there is choice involved in our use of social media. We're going to be there. Other folks are going to be there. Young people are going to be there. And I think that there is a right for adults to choose what content we want to see. And then there needs to be guardrails up for young people because they make risky choices. That's part of their development, right? They are learning how to make choices that are best for themselves, and they're gonna make mistakes. And what we don't want is for those mistakes to be detrimental to their health and their well-being. And so I wanna give an example that I think is really important because I witnessed a suicide cluster happen in Illinois, in Maywood actually, where I went to high school. And so when one suicide occurs, if you notice, they try not to give details in the news media about the suicide. Why? Because suicide is almost contagious, is the best way to put it. And so an algorithm that's sticky is going to actually increase that exposure to content that could potentially harm other people. And I saw it happen in my old neighborhood. And this is a Black community where I'll say that young Black people's suicide rates are increasing at rates we haven't seen before. And so that's an example of how an algorithm can do harm.
What's interesting is there's a really subtle choice there. So some people sometimes ask me, like, what's the difference between Reddit and Facebook, or like Reddit and Instagram? On Reddit, your friend can go down very dark corners and it won't affect you. Like, they don't put stuff in your feed because your friend became a conspiracy theorist. On places like Instagram or Facebook, your friend can put a heart on something, and if that's part of a suicide network, there are networks of these accounts that glorify suicide, suddenly it can show up in your feed. And so it's an intentional design choice that ends up having very unintentional consequences.
And by the way, the stats on suicide now are off the charts, particularly, right? And it's interesting, we got in a big fight with Netflix a few years ago, with Reed, directly with Reed, over a show they had that was extremely popular called 13 Reasons Why. Sage, I'm sure you, right?
Yeah.
And actually Reed Hastings, the founder, who's a pretty decent guy. He's a libertarian, but he's a very smart guy. But he actually saw this, because after the show came out, our point to them was it's contagious. It's that even though, and they finally started putting warnings, but it was their #1 show for a while on Netflix, right? And what it was doing, though, it was clearly encouraging at least suicidal ideation, right? So what kind of advice, Sage, if we gave you the magic wand, what would you say to either the people running these big platforms, or if you decided to, which you probably will given your activism, go into public policy at some point? What would you like to see happen, either at the platform level or at the regulatory level?
It's a great question. And before I go into the answer, I want to give a reaction is that to hear about this legislation, I'm so excited. And also it occurred to me, we're all the prey of social media, right? They're preying on our attention, and young people especially. And also the blame has been placed on us, that it's it's clearly causing mental health consequences, but also it's your fault for scrolling. It just occurred to me now that it's not my fault. That all of my peers who are actively struggling with it, but also were but that's my bad. It was me stuck on TikTok for hours. But no, that is not true.
Sage, can I give you a kind of sobering example of how optional this is?
Of course, yeah.
So let's imagine, so how many of you have a thing on your phone that says hey, it's your bedtime, do you want to go to bed? Anyone? How many of you just hit dismiss? I'm definitely guilty of this one, right? Those are not effective interventions. And part of why they're there is because they're not effective interventions. Let's imagine for a second, on Instagram, there was a feature where you could say at 10 a.m. when you still had willpower, or noon, I want to go to bed at 11. And for 2 hours before that, Instagram got a little bit slower and a little bit slower and a little bit slower. It's almost like you had to push a little harder to make the feed go. We know from 20 years of data that if you put a little bit of latency, that slowness in, people use it way less. So imagine if you had that nice soft landing and your bedtime came and you're I kind of want to go to bed. That feature is live today on Instagram if you're stealing content from Instagram. If you're downloading content, you're stealing it, they will slow your experience down slowly so you will get less content. Because if they just stop you, you'll get a new account. So they could launch that feature in 2 weeks if they wanted. And the reason they don't is because they want you to keep consuming. They don't want you to think of their product as dangerous, that you would need a feature like that to stop.
Wow.